So on the morning of Monday, July 18, 2022, sun rose, another work day began. But at Netflix, today felt a little different, and for many Netflix employees, or Netflixers as we call ourselves, today was a little different than the typical Monday morning workday. Because today was day one of our migration to Confluence Cloud. Throughout the weekend, a small but dedicated and determined team worked through a detailed migration runbook. Pre-migration work, communications, default access rules, preloading attachments, and more had started 2 weeks before. The first step of the actual production migration began on Friday at 5 p.m. This was the point of no return. Step 32, the last step, was completed at 8:20 p.m. on Saturday, 27 hours after step 1, and 8 hours behind our schedule. Something Netflixers really love is automation. And the only thing we love more than that is technical solutions to complex problems. For testing the migration, we invented a tool from scratch we called Raygun. On Saturday at 5 p.m., Raygun went to work inspecting everything from permissions to attachments. Despite being hours behind schedule, 64,631 past tests gave the migration team confidence that the migration had been successful. Still, the team harbored some doubts. Did we miss something during testing? Did we unknowingly leave some data behind? Would some team today be completely derailed and unable to work? And probably most importantly of all, would the team be still employed in 24 hours? So on the morning of Monday, July 18th, 2022, migration team sipped their coffee, opened Slack, navigated to the Jira Confluence Help Migration Support channel, and wondered what fortune the day might bring. But 12 months earlier, we weren't even thinking about cloud. So the story of Netflix's migration decides with why we decided to migrate. Pre-migration at Netflix, we were pretty happy with Jira and Confluence on-prem. We had a pretty typical setup. We have data center and server, about 6,000 active users. And we had a high degree of automation. This screenshot's from our internal deployment application called Spinnaker. And back in 2020, for Team 2020, I was on the docket to give a talk called How We Learn to Stop Worrying and Love Weekday Upgrades, which was all about how we had such confidence in our operational tooling and our ability to manage and operate Jira that we would do patch releases, zero downtime upgrades, ZDU patch releases during the weekday. We like to joke we'd kick them off at Monday 9 a.m. at times that our users were most active, but we had such high confidence with our ability to run and manage and operate and patch these tools that we just felt very comfortable doing this. And we're data rich, the same metrics which monitor Netflix's streaming service that we use to deliver video to millions of customers. This is the same monitoring system we're using to monitor Jira on-prem, data center, and Confluence. And we collect thousands of metrics, all the typical stuff, network, CPU, memory, JVM garbage collection information, JMX stuff being emitted by Jira. You name it, we collect it. It goes into our metrics database, and we can alert on it. So we were pretty happy with on-prem. This was looking great, like comfortable with the product, love the feature set, users are happy. So why do we want to migrate? Well, one thing was new and cloud-only features. We had noticed over time that new features were landing on cloud first. Sometimes they were landing exclusively on cloud, and they weren't available for our users on-prem. Great example, yesterday's keynote, the AI announcement is cloud-only. Those are some great features, but you got to be on cloud to get them. Easier integrations. When you run on-prem, you've got firewalls, you've got VPNs, you've got security folks who say no to everything. You got a lot of issues to deal with. And every time somebody said, like, we want to connect to Airtable, we want to connect to Asana, we want to connect to this or that, that's a mini project to figure out how to get those network connections set up. Faster upgrades. We were on the LTS versions of these products, which was fine for us because we could get security updates, but we were at least one LTS version behind, and we weren't on the cutting edge of features that were coming out in the latest releases. So when a user opened up the internet, went to Atlassian and saw a features list for the latest version of Jira, they could expect that they wouldn't land in our on-prem product for at least a year, maybe even longer. And we'd been watching with interest as Atlassian slowly improved the maximum users that they'll allow on their platform, went 2,000, 5,000, and when they reached 10,000, then we realized, okay, that barrier for us to move to cloud had been removed. You can handle the user count that we have at Netflix. So, I mean, it was really that simple for us. Netflix is a very bottom-up company. Once we had made the case or started to put this case together, we talked to people, we talked to leadership. They're like, yeah, that looks good. This makes sense to us. We like happy users. Moving to the cloud makes sense. You could free up the team from the operational burden of running these systems day to day, maybe move them up the stack. So it was pretty straightforward for us to get leadership support. A little bit surprising, but yeah, kind of typical for Netflix. So as we started the migration, the first thing we did started downloading the migration playbooks, looking at what the steps were. We engaged with a Atlassian partner. We knew we weren't going to have the expertise nor the bandwidth to really pull off this migration by ourselves, so we signed up a partner. And then the easiest step of all, we installed JCMA, CCMA, and started pressing buttons. It's just a plug-in in server. You download it, you put it in there, press buttons, and you can start seeing how migrations work. So, I mean, we were excited. We're like, let's go. We're ready to go to cloud. Let's do this. When you start your journey to the cloud, this is from Atlassian's documentation. This is their standard phased migration approach. And this is what they recommend organizations follow to get started. It's where we started to follow to get our cloud migration journey going. But as we started following these steps, we immediately ran into some headwinds. First kind of problem is JCMA versus site import. So you got two choices when you migrate. You can have JCMA or CCMA, or you can do site imports. There's a kind of, I say confusing, but there's like different pros and cons to which tool you're going to pick. And the different tools have strengths and minuses. We were thinking JCMA, CCMA, these are supported tools. This is probably a slam dunk. We just want to go that route. But then when I talked to other people, very recently, like in the last few weeks, who have done a migration, they're like, you're crazy for using JCMA. Like, site import worked great for us. It's a much simpler tool to use. So the point being, when you're ready to start a migration, this is kind of a tough one to start with of, which tool do I pick and which one's the best for me? And it's going to depend on your the type of data you're migrating, the amount of data. There's this matrix of like pros and cons you've got to navigate. And again, the point being, when we are excited about a migration, this started to take some of the wind out of our sails. Ooh, app assessments. So this is where things really started to get fun. We started to get into our app assessments. This is a screenshot of late in the app migration process. Apps are complicated. In the best case, there's a cloud version of that app, that marketplace app, and it's feature compatible with what your on-prem version is, and that is like the easiest path for migration. Then it just kind of goes downhill from there. There's apps that are on cloud but have a different feature set, and then there's apps that aren't on cloud at all, and you've got to find substitute apps. And then for us, also, we were trying to figure out, is this app being used or not? Do we have to even migrate this app? So that is like locating data, or finding data, somehow figuring out which apps are being used by which teams, and how critical is that app to that team? Is that like a essential part of their workflow that they couldn't live without, or is that something somebody did once on a Friday for a couple hours and then they never looked at it ever again? We don't know. We just know the app's installed. So we had 43 of these things to deal with, And every single one was an exercise of that, what I just described, going through that calculus of what are we going to do with this thing? How are we going to migrate it to cloud? Do we need it to migrate it to cloud? And that slowed us down. All this stuff together started to slow us down. Atlassian Access was another one that slowed us down. Part of our problem here is Netflix has this very unique identity systems. They don't support SCIM. Our security folks weren't excited about hooking up LDAP to Atlassian Access. So that created some challenges for us. If your organization kind of uses more standards, more like compatible standards, this may not be a big deal. For us, it was a big deal. We had to engage with our identity partners, engage with our security partners, and come up with custom workflows that would land our identity data using our kind of internal, weird internal systems, land that identity data onto cloud through Atlassian Access. And we had to do that before we migrated a single space or a single issue. This was unexpected. We knew there'd be some steps there to get Access onboarded. We weren't expecting like, oh, geez, now we need like an identity migration project as well. Okay, then data quality issues. So the way I like to talk about this topic, our Confluence has been around for a long time. And the oldest piece of data we have on Confluence, we asked ourselves, what is that? And we found it. It was this Confluence page created by an ex-Netflix employee back in 2007. And it is a great example of when you have a system that's been around for a number of years, in this case 15 years at time of migration, you have a lot of junk. You've got data, apps, admins who had maybe different ideas of what governance meant, users with different, sourced from different systems. We had gone through a couple of user directory migrations. Some people came from were sourced from directories which were no longer exist at Netflix. Some came from the internal directory. They were onboarded long enough before we even had an identity system. Users had different formats. Cloud uses email addresses. We have, in some cases, like just the domain part, like the beginning part, username at email address. So we just cut off and use that for a period of time as our user identity. So we had some mismatches there with cloud, and just general hackery and tomfoolery. One of the great things about on-prem is you got direct access to the database. If you need to update a table or change some of the database rules, you can do that. And you could also install some open source app, right? And that might have changed some tables or changed something and then it uninstalled and you had no idea because it was before you worked there. And now the migration tools kind of notice that something's not right with the data, something's migrated, some tables have changed, some rows are not where it expects, and now this stuff trips up the migration tools. As we got into the actual meat and guts of the migration, we started doing this testing loop. So we'd create a test plan using CCMA. We would run that test plan through CCMA itself. That would generate some errors, and data errors and app errors. Then we'd do some testing. Our team would do some ad hoc testing. We'd throw it over the fence to some select users. They would start reporting issues. And then we'd repeat that. That was our testing loop. Come up with a plan, run it through CCMA, test it, fix as many errors as we could, and repeat. And we had issues. CCMA was inconsistent. CCMA versions were kind of changing. The behavior would change across different versions. It was report errors, one run that wouldn't show up on the next run. We were just really kind of thrown off by the inconsistency of that tool. So as an example of the CCMA errors, we had one specific example we had was problems we're having with attachments. So this is a screenshot from one of our CCMA test runs. And with this particular space report, CCMA is reporting 100%, green check mark, everything's cool, everything's good. There's 100%. But then when we looked at this is what it looks like on-prem. This is a typical space with some attachments. But when we looked at the post-migration version on cloud, the page is there, text is there, the attachments are registered, but they're not showing up. They're all broken links. As we started to do our own testing and threw it over the fence to our UAT testers, the migration team was getting overwhelmed with just too many errors. Users were reporting formatting errors, which is related to the apps, formatting errors related to the tools, the attachment issues I mentioned. The permissions were messed up for various reasons, and we were just getting overwhelmed with error reports. And as all this was happening, it was taking us weeks to get through an iteration. We would do a test, we would go through the errors, try to fix it, try to catalog and triage the errors, fix as many as we can, and then test again. And it was taking us weeks. And just after a couple of migration test runs, we were now months into the migration project already. So this kind of led to a crisis point for us. We felt our testing was in this death spiral where we didn't feel like we were making sufficient progress. We were starting to feel like, when attachments aren't landing, that CCMA is not doing its job. We're just not getting enough out of this tool to get us all the way there. And then on top of this was spring 2022, and this Atlassian had it's probably its worst day ever for cloud, the April 2022 outage. And so our earlier, let's go to cloud, we're all in, became, maybe we need to stay on-prem. And this really was a crisis point. I mean, we really had serious discussions about, maybe the cloud isn't for us. Maybe we need to let these tools mature a little bit. Maybe we just need to back off and revisit this in a year, put our efforts elsewhere. So before we decided to completely retreat, we wanted to take stock and see what we can do to move ourselves forward. One thing we thought of, I've kind of jumped between Confluence and Jira, but at the beginning we were evaluating both at the same time, doing the app assessments, dealing with data issues on both products. We thought if we could just focus on Confluence first and deal with Jira later, that would free the team to just focus on Confluence. We could descope and limit what we had to deal with. We knew we had to address these CCMA errors. There was whatever was going on with CCMA. We had to get some data insight into what was going on, where it was failing, what we could do about it. We had to get a grip on our UAT errors. We were just getting too many of these, and they were coming too fast. And we had to iterate faster. Instead of taking weeks, we wanted to get to the point where we're taking days to get through these testing loops. We felt if we could do this, then maybe there was a path forward for us and we didn't have to completely abandon. So addressing CCMA errors, this is where Raygun came in. This is where the tool I mentioned at the beginning. It is a Python app we developed in-house, and it tests spaces, pages, permissions, and attachments, but it does that by looking at, we run a test migration. We have our Confluence, or our cloud version of that, and we have our on-prem version. So what we want to do then is have Raygun walk through every space, like a loop, for all spaces, for all pages in that space, check to see if that page made it to cloud, check to see if all the comments made it, check to see if all the content looks like it's there, and then loop through all the attachments on each page. Are the attachments registered to that page? And then beyond that, we found that if we did a head request against the attachment on cloud, that would tell us if it actually was there versus like that broken image that I showed earlier. And we did the same thing for permissions. Is the space permissions as they are on-prem, or did they land there on cloud? So it evolved over time. It started off, we just, the basic, is the space there, is the page there type stuff. And then as time went on, we just added more and more tests. Eventually, 60,000 plus tests. And it also evolved to fix errors. So getting back to this attachment issue, I described how Raygun could detect these attachments that were broken. And that helped us a lot. That told us which spaces had problems. We could exclude those from user testing, so that then they didn't have duplicate reports. Like, you don't have to tell us the attachments are broken. We know they're broken. So that kind of conversations were avoided. Gave us actionable feedback we could give to Atlassian. It's like, these attachments aren't coming over. We keep trying, but they're not coming over. But we're thinking, Raygun knows the attachments are missing and knows the pages. It's got a link to them on-prem. Maybe Raygun can just move the attachments over. And so that's what we did, is we modified Raygun so that when it couldn't find an attachment, it would just move those attachments over by itself, and then rerun the test, and then report not that the attachment was missing, but give us the check mark that those tests had passed. The next thing we did was prioritize these errors. And I mean, this is just basic stuff. This was suggested to us by our TAM, but this really helped us get a grip on the errors we're experiencing. So we divided our spaces into tiers based off of usage and activity. And for Confluence, we did 3 tiers. And we said, we're going to prioritize errors differently based on this. So if you're a tier 3 product space, you're not used much. We have the data. We know you're not used much. We have the data for that. So if, say, Raygun reports an error on a tier 3 space, then we don't work on that, or we deprioritize it. And that means that maybe we don't fix it. Maybe we fix it after migration. Maybe we don't fix it ever. But that keeps our iteration cycles going fast, because we're not wasting time on errors which are not significant. Tier 2 spaces were kind of on the, we would prioritize those in the medium, and then tier 1 spaces we would address immediately. Those are people that are actively using it. They're going to have problems when we migrate unless we address it immediately. So it's such a simple thing to prioritize, but it is not something we thought of until like mid through the project, after we had all these issues and reports coming to us. So speaking about iterating faster, there were a couple of other things we did that we could get through our test cycle as quickly as we could. One was we scaled Raygun. Early on versions of Raygun took hours to run, which just slowed everything down. But we introduced threads and parallel testing so we could run this stuff as fast as possible. Then another thing was slowing us down was we provisioned these test sites in cloud. We called them dash upside down 1, dash upside down 2, dash upside down 3. When you work at Netflix, everything's got to be named after a show. It took time to provision these sites. There was some back-end stuff that had to be done. We had to get engaged with an engineer sometimes, and it was just slow. But we got to a point where, like, hey, let's just provision all 11 of these at once. We think we're going to need 11. Let's get these out going and set up for us. As soon as we're ready to run our next migration plan, everything's ready to go for us. So this is how it started to play out then. End of May, upside down 5. We ran 30,000 tests. We're using Raygun. Had 400 errors. A couple weeks later, we increased our test count. We got up to 62,000 tests. So we increased the number of tests we were running. We were also like, 3 times the errors. So more things we're looking at, which is good, but still a lot of problems that we're discovering with the site. But this is significant because we're finding this using automated test tooling that runs in 30 minutes versus users that are reporting to this and going through that whole cycle. And then flashing forward to upside down 9, this was starting to look better. We had gotten the number of errors down by a factor of 10. And then finally, by upside down 10, we're down to 0 errors. All our tests are passing, and now we know, like, okay, we're ready. We've got our CCMA version locked in. We know how it's going to run. Everything looks good. We're ready to migrate this thing. But there was one last surprise the migration had for us, and this had to do with links. So we thought this was going to be easy. We knew the endpoint to cloud was different. Our on-prem site was confluence.netflix.net. We knew the cloud endpoint would have a different DNS name, so we thought, okay, well, we'll just redirect people. We'll create a redirect rule to send people to cloud, easy peasy. Well, it's not that simple. There's some URL differences with cloud. There's some differences in the pathing. In this example, it injects the wiki part of the URL in there. So a simple DNS change is not going to be enough. That's just not going to work. So we were thinking about it, and we said, all right, we know how to write Apache rewrite rules. Maybe we'll keep the old site up, replace it with, it is already front-ended by Apache, which is very convenient. So we'll have a bunch of regex rules that we'll inject, and that will inject the right path, and we'll send users on their way. So cool. But then we started looking deeper. And we looked at our Slack, we looked at our Google Docs where a lot of documentation is stored. We looked at our internal URL shortener, our Netflix Go links, and we found that a lot of people had bookmarked Confluence URLs with page IDs. This is a problem. There's really no amount of regex in the world that's going to remap a page ID. So what we did at the last minute here, kind of late in the game, we decided to put together another service. This one's called Alluvium. It was named by my coworker who's in the room, but alluvium is like the sediment at the bottom of a river that doesn't flow away, so kind of the crap left over. So what Alluvium does is it's a Spring Boot standalone Java application that handles all of these redirection things. So it does a simple thing, we were doing with Apache regex of fixing the URLs, but we also found we could scrape Confluence for all the page IDs on-prem, and something we didn't realize at the time, this also solved tiny URLs. We can query Confluence on-prem, say, give me all your page IDs as they exist today for all spaces, give me all your tiny URLs, and we can grab those page titles, and we can load that into Alluvium. And then when people hit Alluvium with a page ID, a legacy page ID, we can do a remap to the title and then redirect people properly to cloud. And this also helped us for some other use cases that involved apps. Some of the apps, this actually was reported post-migration, some of the apps had a different URL path. So the redirector would land you in a space in cloud that just wouldn't work. But once we realized what that mapping was, we can push an update to Alluvium and then land people at the right spot. So this was really useful for us as far as having a really good user experience at migration day, because we found like 1,600-ish bookmarks had page IDs in them, and those would have been 1,600 bad user experiences and maybe even 1,600 bad user reports of a problem on migration day. So back to Monday, July 18th. The Slack team the migration team's in Slack. We put our announcement up. Confluence Cloud migration is complete. What's going to happen? What are users going to report? What do we miss? Well, it turns out we had a really easy day. We had this is our Slack channel from that day, a lot of Jira stuff as usual. But one Confluence problem with the migration is because on our migration documentation site, we ran out of licenses. Which just was not configured correctly for the amount of people that wanted to read about the migration itself. So it was a separate site, ran out of licenses, but our main site had all the right licenses and people had a really smooth migration experience. So where are we today? Confluence today, we've been able to achieve the migrations we were hoping for. We've been able to link to new SaaS products that are cloud hosted pretty easily. We've been able to take advantage of new features. One that was we weren't planning on, but kind of happened, was guest accounts has been really helpful for us. Netflix partners with external vendors and developers for things like localization, QA testing on games, where they're engaged with Netflix for a short period of time. And this guest account feature lets us onboard external vendors really quickly and easily without having to deal with all the issues you have with on-prem, of VPN access, identity onboarding, et cetera. And it's also maintenance free. I remember having to do log4shell over Christmas one year. There's been none of that with Confluence since we moved to cloud. The Jira migration, I mentioned we split it out. It's still ongoing. After, as we did Confluence, we found problems and then kind of wrote tools quickly to try to close those gaps and close those spaces between. For Jira, we said, okay, we know we're going to need some serious tooling to get Jira across the finish line. We're going to come up with a bunch of tools up front. We know we're going to need dashboards, we're going to need redirectors, we're going to need testing tools, Raygun for Jira. We know we're going to need stuff that inspects and fixes data issues. So from the get-go, when Jira kicked off, we just like, okay, we need to take some time at the beginning and just work on our tools and get those in order. That's what we did. We really leaned into tiers for Jira as well. We've got 4 tiers of Jira, and tier 2 we actually divided into 4 sub-tiers. I should mention that for Jira, Confluence was lift and shift. We did the entire migration in a weekend. All of Confluence moved over. For Jira, we're doing it hybrid by projects. So we're picking out these tiers of projects, same type of criteria as before. Are these projects based on activity, usage, dependencies to stuff we know how to migrate versus the stuff we don't know how to migrate? We have them divided into these tiers, and then we're running migrations on these tiers and having some projects on cloud and some projects on-prem, and using our redirectors to control where that traffic's going. So it's pretty seamless to the users, hopefully. They just type in the same URL they always do, and if their project's been migrated, they go to cloud. If it hasn't been migrated, well, it just does what it always does. It goes to on-prem. And we also developed these dashboards that we actually have a database that keeps track of the project, and then this dashboard reports on the database and lets people know what the status is of their project. Is it on cloud? Is it on-prem? And then we share some of the insights we have, like activity, data dependencies, are using structure or not, or these other things that might cause us headaches for migration. Users can search for their own projects and understand where they are in the migration process. So what do we learn from the whole Confluence migration? CCMA is great. It does a lot of hefty lifting, but it can't get you across the finish line. We needed to develop tools around it to get us all the way there. Again, tools are critical. We could not have done this without testing tools, without redirector tools, without all the tools I mentioned. Tiers and priorities let us scope the work based off of different dimensions, like dependencies to stuff we know how to migrate versus we don't know how to migrate, activity, usage, things like that. There's all kinds of ways you can slice and dice a migration, and we started to lean into that. And then speedy iterations really helped us feel like we weren't in these death loops of testing, and that we could get through it and then fix our errors and then get to the next iteration. It gave the team a cadence for the integration and let us know we were on actually a real death march. That is the end. That is Netflix's cloud migration story.
Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask?
Yeah, how you doing? I'm JC from Electronic Arts in Los Angeles. Just a quick question. Have you had any talks with Atlassian on bridging that gap from the CCMA to the custom tools that you built to kind of help with these migrations, or?
Yes, there's a lot going on with migration. I couldn't put it all in here. Something that worked really well, or Atlassian was great. They gave us a lot of support through this migration. We had dedicated technical person for us, project manager person, and they listened to all of our feedback all through this process. The attachment stuff especially, they were really trying to get to the bottom of that. We sent them information. Raygun helped us get more specific about the issue we were having as an example, but we also sent them like copies of part of our data to try to help them get there. So they're listening. I think you have to ask Atlassian if they're gonna action on any of these tools. Like I said, you can't do a big migration without some of these tools, in my opinion. But yeah, you have to ask Atlassian about their plans for tools.
I guess one follow-up, you guys going to try to sell those tools or what?
We want to open source both Illuvium and Raygun, but it takes time.
Great presentation. It was quite useful. Couple of questions. One is like, how big was your instance in terms of the content-wise? I know you mentioned you had 6,000 users.
Okay.
And so what was the content? Like how many spaces or roughly like the number of pages maybe? Like.
Oh man, that's a good question. I meant to look up spaces before the talk and I forgot. It was in use since 2015, so it's not the largest migration that ever happened. It's in the medium tier. I know for Jira we have, because it's top of mind, we have 1,500 projects and 1.4 million issues. Okay. So again, these aren't huge sites for migration, but that's not always what drives the complexity of the migration.
The follow-up question then is, how many resources that you had to accomplish this?
Yeah, good question. Our team internally is pretty small. Total for our team was, supporting all of these products was 4 people. And out of that group was part-time people working on them. Well, they're all full-time, but working on them. I was full-time on it. I would bring in other people on the team to help out on certain things like developing tools. Precipio is our migration partner, and they added folks to us too. Or of course they had people to help us, so they added another 2 to 3.
Okay, all right, quite helpful. This is the last question, I promise. For your Jira migration that you are currently in flight, like, what are your reasons to do that? Like, I know if you have a lot of customizations built in Jira, Cloud probably doesn't have all of those features. Like, how are you able to overcome or backfill them?
The question is, how are we dealing with feature gaps on Cloud?
Yes. Yeah.
It's a good question. Honestly, probably not as well as we should. I mean, with doing the app assessments, we get some insight to that, and doing our own homework, we can see the features. And in those cases, we can go out to the teams and say, hey, this feature doesn't exist. In our own knowledge of our user base, we know what teams lean on certain features and it's critical to them just in our own interaction. So it's more very, very unscientific way to answer that question. But yeah, the other way you get that feedback is when the user tries to do something on Cloud and it doesn't work. So as part of our migrations, we do give teams a time period where we migrate their stuff to Cloud. And hey, go look at your stuff post-migration on this test site and tell us what is missing. And honestly, we lean on that a lot to give us feedback about feature differences in Cloud versus on-prem. Yeah, I mean, we should. That's not a very satisfactory answer, I think, but that's our approach.
Hey, looking back now, if you were 12 months out thinking about a cloud migration, what would you do with the system or the users now? Would you go and prune things out? What kind of things would you do to kind of prepare the systems and your users for that? Asking for a friend.
Well, I had the slide where I talked about the things we did differently with Jira, where we leaned into the tools early on. I think that's really important. I heard some at Pulse on Tuesday. There was a customer panel, and somebody mentioned about they changed their governance model to reduce the number of things like workflows and permission schemes and things like that. I was listening to that and thinking, hey, that's kind of interesting because we're having issues with workflows and just the sprawl of workflows and permission schemes. At the time, I mean, we thought of that beforehand, but it was like, okay, do we want to just focus on the migration work, or do we also want to do a whole governance campaign as well? And ultimately, we opted to just focus on migration and just move it all. If I had to do things again, which I think was your question, what would I do differently? I think we would examine the governance stuff more and look at that harder for the intent purposes of reducing the amount of stuff we have to migrate, not necessarily to put a strict governance model in place. Okay.
Hey Ed, thanks for putting this together. Prior to the migration, you mentioned that Netflix captured a lot of metrics related to JMX, CPU, maybe even page performance. So post-migration, what is your strategy to ensure that the user experience and the page performance is on par with your on-prem experience?
That's a good question. One of our teammates had that concern as well, is like what kind of operational metrics can we expect? There's some analytical stuff you can get in cloud. It's more it's not the same though, it's not the operational stuff. I mean, ultimately, this is kind of Atlassian's job to run it. And post-migration, the performance on cloud has been better than our on-prem. There's different dimensions to this migration. One of the things that happened during this, Netflix used to be very California-centric. They're worldwide. Now we're more worldwide company. Our on-prem stuff was limited to one region in AWS, whereas like Confluence Cloud and Jira Cloud, all these cloud products have support multiple regions. They do static asset caching so that per region your performance is better for users who aren't close to like wherever your servers are on-prem. So that's another good question. Like maybe we should have required that up front, but we didn't. But in the end, it hasn't been an issue for us. The performance is better than it was on-prem, and there's been zero user issues with cloud. And something I didn't mention in the talk is the Jira, the mobile apps for these products are much better for the cloud version, and people have started using the mobile apps more. So it just speaks to the better performance that we get. So far hasn't been an issue for us.
Hi. First, thanks for the talk. With Wells Fargo, we have a scale that's about 10 times as large as yours. So related to the what would you do differently question, would you still go app by app, or would you maybe do use case by use case or team by team? And just by the way, talking to Atlassian, they say they are early. Success rate with their migration assistant tools was 28%, and now they're up to 93%. So hopefully that's some confidence-inspiring stats. So yeah, how would you maybe approach it differently?
If I understand the question, is how would I migrate your cloud? I migrate your stuff to cloud? Yeah, I don't know. Honestly, I feel like we were pushing these tools to the limit with our amount of data, and it felt like it was right at the edge of what the tools could handle. So yeah, you say 10 times, yeah, that makes me a little nervous. There are people in the audience. I know Matt from LinkedIn over here in the front row is kind of facing that same problem. How is he going to migrate Jira that has 10 times the issues? The things we talked about at breakfast this morning. The things we talked about were things like, Matt told me he wasn't going to migrate all those issues. So that's the first thing I'd probably do, is not migrate everything. If there's junk you can not migrate, I'm sure you have old stuff like we did. And that was something we discussed. Do we need to migrate everything? And it's kind of related to the governance question of, do you want to run a cleanup project before you want to do your migration, or you just want to put all your energy into the migration? We opted to put all our energy into migration and just move it all over, because we didn't want to go track people down, we didn't want to spend that time and energy, which is limited, to go find people and teams and determine what data we wanted to retire. That would be the first place I'd start if I were you, is figure out what data you don't need to move, maybe enable new projects on cloud. There's complications with that, getting that to work with on-prem and the hybrid, you're running both, is kind of complicated. That's something to consider. Get rid of junk. Oh, get rid of apps. If you've got apps, you just start looking at those with a critical eye and figuring out how to get rid of those. The less apps you have, the easier a migration is going to be.